Morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning for our webinar on the business-wide risk assessment for credit unions. Just while we're waiting on a lot of people to join, I think we're over the 100 mark on today's registration. So there's a lot of people still kind of trickling in through Zoom. Just a bit of housekeeping, if that's okay. So today's session is being recorded. So we'll send out the slides and the recording later today. So yeah, feel free to make notes. But yeah, you will get all the resources afterwards. There is a Q&A box at the bottom or on a toolbar in Zoom. At any stage throughout the webinar, do feel free to pop your questions in there, and Sandy and I will answer them either throughout the webinar or at the very end. We'll try and leave some time to answer any questions that people might have. And that's really it in terms of the housekeeping. So there's still people kind of trickling in, but for the sake of time and to make sure we have enough time for questions at the end, I think we might kick off. So for those of you who don't know us, my name is Chris Hanlon. I'm the CEO here with CalcuRisk. And I'm joined by my colleague, Sandy O'Leary, who's our head of risk advisory here and runs our risk advisory service for credit unions. So CalcuRisk, as some of you will know, and I know some of you are using the system and are subscribed to the risk advisory service, we basically offer a governance, risk and compliance software that helps with everything from your automating your risk register, dashboard reporting, incident management, right through to being able to have a board meeting portal and everything else. And our risk advisory service launched about 18 months ago now at this stage, I think. And that is a service that helps with basically risk advice, templates, guidance notes, and everything else in between. We're working with credit unions well over 10 years now, probably 11 or 12 years at this stage, I'd say. And the CalcuRisk solution is actually used by over 100 credit unions throughout Ireland. So what I'm going to do is that's just a bit about us. So I'm going to pass over to Sandy now, if that's okay, who's going to take us through a bit of context on what the business-wide risk assessment is, why we should care, and that sort of stuff. And then at the end of that, I'll take us through a bit of around how the CalcuRisk solution can potentially help automate and streamline some of the kind of manual nature of that. So Sandy, maybe over to you for a while, if that's okay.
Good morning. Thanks, Chris. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. One of the subjects close to my heart in my previous iteration of my role in life as a risk and compliance officer was one of the, I guess there's lots of things in a day-to-day role in risk and or compliance where you kind of go, if I had only a bit more time, I'd like to do this, this, and this, and I'd love to be able to give it a bit more time and attention. And I guess this is what we've done with this area over the last few months. At the initial instigation of a credit union, that were asking for more guidance on this anyway. So it's one of these areas that has changed in terms of what's happening out there in the world. I suppose significant progress has been made over the years in terms of the combating of money laundering and financial crime generally. There's been a huge effort on the part of the likes of the Financial Action Task Force and Interpol in Europe on limiting opportunities for criminals to finance their criminal activities. And the more progress that has been made on that, the tighter it has become in terms of criminals getting access to the legitimate financial sector to clean their funds. One of the other, I suppose, major drivers behind this also was COVID, obviously, in the sense that it accelerated that general move that had already been well underway from the use of cash to deal with transactions generally, and really, I suppose, accelerated that move to the digital channels during that period. And cash has always been traditionally known as one of the major ways of laundering funds. So for the kind of cash channels to have dwindled quite significantly in a short period of time, she forced more and more to, criminals and criminal associations to look for other ways to launder their funds. So they've been putting a lot more time and energy into, we've all seen it, kind of the types of fraud where they can get cash, not least kind of mobile phone fraud, all that sort of thing that we're seeing more and more of in the last few years. And on top of that, then obviously because of a lot of this change in how criminals are accessing the legitimate channels, at an international level, they've been changing the legislation in this area. So we are expecting new legislation to be implemented in the coming months. That will include a strengthening of the AML and CFT rules that are already in place, and we will introduce a new AML authority, which will improve supervision of AML and combating the financing of terrorism and supporting the national EU financial investigative units. So there is more coming, and that's a whole other day's work, which we won't get into today. We'll be here for the rest of the week. So that's, I guess, the context behind kind of developing the solution as a way to help, both in terms of the risk and compliance area, to help demonstrate how the credit union is managing its own business-wide risk assessment. So why do we need one at all? Again, just to kind of put it in terms that are relatable. As we mentioned earlier, criminals are always looking for new and better ways for them to access the legitimate network. So credit unions have to be constantly vigilant, and particularly with new products and services. And we are going through a period of change with credit unions in terms of looking for opportunities to develop and support their members through new products and services. But that in itself provides opportunities if it's not managed in a certain way, and if the risks, the associated AML and CFT risks, are not managed. Credit unions are responsible for managing that ever-present risk. And none of us, either as members of credit unions or as credit union officers, want them to be used, or to have to admit that they were used to launder funds or to finance terrorist activities. So it's very much on the burden on credit unions to mitigate the potential consequences that could arise. And, we do need to think about the fact that with all risk, there can be most risks, there can be a financial cost, a reputational damage, and operational disruption. We tend to immediately kind of think, well, what's the financial cost to the business if it were to happen? But the other two are very key, particularly in the credit union movement, and we'll cover that shortly. Every credit union, as we all know, has limited resources, and it is very important that there's a way, I suppose, to analyze and identify how best to use those resources. So it's really important that we can analyze the AML and CFT area so that we can identify how best to allocate the limited resources that are there. It's one of the key reasons. And ultimately, credit unions do need to be able to provide risk-based assurances to regulators whenever they're requested. Depending on industries, some industries have to submit regular returns, but in credit unions, generally, it's just about being able to demonstrate it on request. So it needs to be maintained, be updated, and be available should central bank or the PRA, whichever regulator it is, want to see what the credit union is doing and how they're getting on with the ongoing management of the risks that are associated with it. And ultimately, why we do it is to be compliant. It is very clearly specified in the Criminal Justice Act and the 2010 Act, and in the sectoral guidelines that came out in relation to compliance with that act, that credit unions have to identify the money laundering and terrorist financing risks that are relevant to their business. And it's very specific in that it says that the assessment must focus on the credit union's members, its products, its delivery channels, and its geographical areas of operation. So the requirement is very clearly delineated and identified. So we have to do it in that specific way. So who cares? Why would we bother? What's the whole point behind all of this? I think fundamentally members would be very unhappy if it were to come to light that their credit union that they support and are members of for probably even generations at this stage had facilitated criminals or terrorists in their activities. It's important that we have that, that the credit unions have that trust that they are acting, I suppose, collectively, almost on behalf of their community for the benefit of their community. So the community itself would not be happy if they were to find that their financial institution, of which they have ownership, would be responsible for this type of activity. I suppose it's amazing that credit union, not amazing, but because it's been well earned, but it is an enviable reputation the credit unions have in the financial sector. And it's something that other financial institutions would sell their souls for. But if the wider public knowledge of poor AML and CFT standards were to come about, either as a result of fines or of incidents, God forbid, that a competitive advantage could change. That could start to erode over time, where confidence, maybe became less of a given. So therefore, it is important that it is front and center in what credit unions do. And it is a high priority for regulators. They've made it very clear over the years that combating money laundering, terrorist financing is a high priority. And in order to inspire confidence with our regulators, who we know can look for this information and wanted to assess how credit unions are doing in this area on a regular basis. So for us, maintaining regulatory confidence, or for credit unions to maintain regulatory confidence, then it's a really key area. You'll have to excuse me if I keep saying us, because I keep forgetting I'm not actually working in a credit union anymore. I'm advising and working so closely with credit unions, I still feel like it's always an us with me. So you'll have to excuse me if I keep using the term as though I was an actual credit union at this stage. So what does a good business-wide risk assessment look like? In their report, the central bank clearly documented its expectations. It is one thing that, there's no real gray areas in this area. They've been very clear as to what they expect. It is documented the credit unions will undertake and document their money laundering and terrorist financing risk assessment to include all those risk categories we've just mentioned. The methodology needs to be clear, and the risk ratings need to be documented and obviously accessible. The appropriate controls are expected to have been devised to mitigate the risks that are associated with both areas, both money laundering and terrorist financing. And those need to be closely aligned with and embedded in the credit union's own operational procedures. It's not sufficient to simply kind of know they exist. You need to be able to be quite clear that they're operating and working in your credit union, and how that's manifests through the procedures and the controls that you have in place. The assessment itself then should identify gaps that are in place, because very few of us are very few creditors are gonna have every control in place at all times and working to its maximum. So it's one of these areas where you can kind of determine what gaps you have at a point in time and have a plan towards achieving them and plugging those gaps, and having a set of resulting actions. Risk assessments generally are reviewed and approved by the board at least annually. That's the expected review period, and they're used to inform the credit union's approach to the management of the money laundering and terrorist financing risk. So as a document, as a supporting framework, it's really important that it's there and accessible. So the underpinning elements that I think that framed a lot of the development around this aspect of the software, there's a few key things that we bore in mind the whole way through the process. That there would be a comprehensive and structured approach to aligning that risk assessment with what's happening on the ground on a day-to-day basis in the operation of the credit union. This is a lot more granular than you're used to in terms of the higher level risks that we look at a risk register. It's far more closely aligned. So they have to be analysed at quite a detailed level under each of the 4 categories which we've looked at. It's important that in this assessment, business-wide assessment, that you give the terrorist financing risks as much attention as the ML risks. It doesn't necessarily mean they'll have as much residual risk at the end of the day once they've been assessed, but to assess at the early stages of the assessment, you do have to give it as much time and attention as you would the money laundering piece at the high-level assessment stage. Any material gaps then that might be identified during the process will form the basis of a subsequent risk mitigation plan. And you can see that it's very much part of what the credit union's own activities, efforts are in terms of managing and monitoring as well the AML and CFT risks. So having kind of put all of that in context, I hope that makes sense. It's the kind of driver behind how this was developed and why it was developed. So what I'm going to do now is hand you back to Chris, who's the expert on the software side, and let him show you exactly how this looks and where we are with it on the software. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, so as Sandy alluded to, hopefully you can see my screen okay, Sandy, can you?
It says screen sharing has stopped. Sorry, 1 second.
The joy of Zoom. Is it coming
Is
up
it
there
on
now?
for me? Yes, I'm seeing it now.
Excellent.
Yep.
So yeah, look, Sandy has painted that picture of the importance of the business-wide risk assessment. And when we were working with a handful of credit unions to figure out what the particular pain points were and how we could help with them, I think it was just the manual nature of it. I think the use of spreadsheets, and then Sandy alluded to it as well, the being able to report to the board on an annual basis, but also the ad hoc kind of delivery method as well, or the ad hoc assurance you might need to provide to a regulator as part of a review, if it's an FCA or PRA review, or if it's a CBI review, or whatever it might be, or even an internal audit. Just being able to be able to demonstrate that assurance. So just to kind of point out a couple of things as we step through the system. I'm conscious some of you will be familiar with CalculaRisk as a system, and others won't be. So the idea behind the application or the system is that I can still have my normal risk register, my normal kind of business as usual risk register in the system. So I have this as, I call it Atlantic Avenue Credit Union, but I then have a separate context or a separate kind of instance of CalculaRisk where I focus on the business-wide risk assessment. The reason why we pulled it out separate is that, as Sandy alluded to it already, it's a good bit more granular, and the expectation is that it's a good bit more granular maybe than your normal risk register, which credit unions will be more than familiar with at this stage. So when I log into the system, I'm in what we call the risks module, and I have my risk portfolios here. The idea here is that I just have a money laundering portfolio and a terrorist financing portfolio. And essentially, we built out templates of potential risks that might be applicable to your individual credit unions, depending on your product, service, geography, and everything else in between. I can click on money laundering and I can drill down into an assessment, or sorry, a list of risks, sorry. And I can see there's 25 or 26 different risks in here. If I want to, I could go and search by a keyword. I can come over here and click on business, or type in business, and I can go and drill down into an assessment on business accounts that I offer through my kind of dummy credit union. You'll notice then I have full control over pretty much everything on the screen. So I can go and I can say, actually, do you know what? I don't like the wording of that risk assessment in the template. I can want to go and change it, or I want to change the details, source, or consequence. So I just started tailoring this to my dummy credit union. I then go down here and I set my inherent level of risk. So in this case, I've set it at 4x4, which gave me a starting point of 16. And Sandy alluded to the importance of having that the risk rating methodology or risk criteria or impact matrix, whatever you might call it, having it defined and documented. So the idea here is you can actually have a separate impact matrix or criteria maintained within the system that's specific to business-wide risk assessment, or AML, or CTF or CFT. And it might be very different to the one that you have for your normal BAU risk register, if that makes sense. So you can see I have one in here. Next step then as part of the assessment is, you'll notice up here I have this controls button. I can click on the controls button and I can see in my dummy credit union I've already linked 9 different controls to this risk. If I wanted to, I can go and open up my control library. I go and click on the link button and I can go and link different controls from within the system basically as well. So these are all pre-populated and maintained within the application as well. You'll notice we do have some kind of coding going on here too. So Sandy mentioned the 4 different categories or 4 different kind of pillars, if that makes sense. So I have membership, and if I scroll right down, I probably have something here around geography or products and things like that. So at any point in time, I can come in and just search for one of the keywords, and I can whittle down that list if I think that control might be something to do with geography rather than products and services, for example. To link a control, it's as straightforward as just clicking the box and hitting link. And that'll increase the number of controls I have basically linked back to my risk. We'll come back and do a bit of a deep dive into the controls just to show you how granular we can go as well in a second. But just come back and focus on the risk. I can see I have these 9 controls. I can see the effectiveness, who owns them, the different control type, and everything else. I can then come down here and set my own residual level of risk. So in my dummy credit union, I've set it's 3 by 3.5, and the system has calculated that at 10.5. If I want to, I could also track target. In this case, you can see actually this risk is outside my appetite or outside my tolerance, and I want to get it down. So I want to get my likelihood from 3 to 2, impact from 3 to 2, and I want my residual to be 4, basically. So what are we going to do to get that to 4? So Sandy mentioned as well, as part of the gaps, you want to be able to document any potential gaps you might have, and then also have action plans in place then to address how you're going to plug those gaps or fix them. That brings us on to our task module up here. If I click on tasks, you can see this risk is outside my appetite or whatever it might be, but I can actually go in and drill into this task. I can see the task is about providing training to all staff on potential AML risks with business accounts. It's in our Dublin office. That could easily be any office if it's linked back to an office for whatever reason. I can see it's the due date is the 3rd of July. It's to do with training, and I'm the task owner. When I hit save, I get an email that alerts me to that. It says, Chris, you need to organize AML training or whatever it might be that's in the box here. There's a link or a URL within that email. I click on the link and it brings me straight to this screen. And I can build my audit trail in here. Sandy mentioned about, again, that assurance point. And I'm sure we're all aware if it's not documented, it's incredibly difficult to demonstrate that it happened or you discussed it. So the importance of minutes and documentation and things like that too. So you can see yesterday, I wrote in a comment saying training scheduled for July 10th. The slides are attached. If I wanted to, I could come in here now saying updated the slides, hit save. And you'll notice today's date, my name, and updated slides. So we're building that audit trail in the system. We're not sending each other Outlook emails back and forth, and in 6 months' time, we're sitting across from the regulator or from our internal auditor looking for that old email of when we updated or when we did AML training or whatever it might be. Everything is stored in a system. I can store the slides there if I want to show how we fix it. I come back out of that. I can also actually store documents here as well at the actual assessment level. So if I wanted to, I could go in and click on the documents. I click on the link, it'll actually open up the file as well. So you can see I have my policy document linked here. I have a risk assessment file. There's no real limit as to what you want to actually be able to store there. One or two other quick things I just want to point out on this screen as well is that in Sandy's slide, she covered the four different areas or categories, if you like, that to kind of track your AML risks across. So you can see I have membership, products and services, channels, and geography or geographical. That ties back nicely when we have a look at a very specific report for the business-wide risk assessment, where it'll actually categorize each of the risks under those four headings as well. And the last piece I wanted to point out on this screen is that I'm conscious I have a lot of the fields actually open here, but just collapse some of them out of the way. Is this historical comments here? And the idea then behind this, again, very similar to the tasks, I can actually come in and say, working on this or whatever it might be. And again, it'll create the audit trail in the system. So as you can imagine, just ease of reporting, you're not looking for those old Outlook emails and everything else like that as well. You have it all available within the system like that. That's building out the risk assessment piece. If we want to kind of move our business-wide risk assessment to potentially being a bit more live, if that makes sense, and maybe even demonstrating some of our controls are working, you can use what we call the monitoring module within the system. And if I just come in here, I've just assigned myself some fairly straightforward monitoring questions. The idea here is that these are automatically pushed out to relevant people in the credit union on a defined periodic basis. That might be monthly, quarterly, annual, you decide. So you can see in this case, I got asked 3 questions. They're all overdue. They were asked yesterday. Were all new members assigned a risk rating in the last month? I can come in and say, yes, I've checked. I can upload evidence if I want to, whatever it might be. If any new members failed the online onboarding journey in the last month, I can actually come in there and I can say 2. And did we review the onboarding procedures in the last year? I'm going to say yes to that one as well. I can refresh the screen then as well to see if there's any other questions there for me that maybe didn't pop up for whatever reason. You can see I've done my questionnaire now, basically. So you can move the risk assessment more from being a kind of a static, maybe annual once a year exercise to being able to demonstrate some of that kind of continuous control monitoring or oversight throughout the year. If I want to, just before we move on to the reports, I can actually drill down as far as the individual controls. So Sandy would have alluded to the fact that this is much more granular again than, and I think the expectation as well is that it's much more granular than our standard risk register. If I want to, I can come in and say, actually, have you anything in here on onboarding, for example? I can whittle that list down. I can go in and drill down into one, for example, here. I can see everything pretty much about that control. Again, these are templates. You can tweak them, change them, add your own controls, add your own assessments, change the wording, remove the control if you don't like it, if you don't think it's a control that's useful to you. In this case, I can see member onboarding procedures are in place and up to date. If I want to, I can actually store the procedures in the system as well, again, as evidence. I can come over here and see this control is rated as unsatisfactory. We'll come back to that in a second and have a look and see why. Unfortunately, Sandy owns this control and it's unsatisfactory. I can link it back to a source. That might be if I want to link it back to a specific piece of legislation, regulation, guidance, or whatever it might be. And I can also assign a frequency to that control as well. So I say this is a control that needs to work on a daily basis, whereas maybe something else only works monthly or quarterly if it's automatic scanning of PEP lists or something like that, or whatever it might be. But one of the things I wanted to point out here on the control is that you can actually go down even further. So you can see I have monitoring questions that are linked to this control. And every month I actually get asked these 3 questions and they get automatically pushed to me with an email alert saying, Chris, you need to answer your control questions for AML this month. I'll get an email and I get brought straight to that screen we were just on. At any point in time, I can come in and click on the report button here. And I can maybe see why that control was unsatisfactory. I'm just going to pop down here. That's linked to quite a few controls. But I can come down here and I can actually see that these are all green in this instance. So maybe it's not a good example of why something is unsatisfactory. But the idea here is you can track all your monitoring and evidence it to any stakeholder that's interested or whatever it might be throughout the whole life cycle of the BWRA as well. To move over to the reporting side of things, we'll have a look at what a typical kind of AML, or sorry, business-wide risk assessment risk register might look like. So if I come down here and open up my custom report section, just going to click here and click on view. And this will look slightly different to your normal risk register, and that'll probably have more columns, be a bit more detailed, and it'll be broken up slightly differently as well. So this essentially is pulling all that information from the risk assessments we would have done and all the control work we would have done, our inherent risk, residual, and targets, and everything else. It's categorizing them then under the different categories of the assessment. So you can see this one here is about delivery channels. It's pulling in my risk, my inherent, my residual, my target, and all the controls I said I have in place as well. And that's coming from that linking that I would have done. If you like, we can easily add a column that shows all the tasks you're currently working on to reduce that level of risk. Or as you can imagine, you can add in red, amber, green colors. If something is over 10, it might be red. If it's over 6, it might be amber, whatever kind of RAG rating you might have. If I scroll through the report, you'll notice I have another yellow bar down here. So this is starting to pull in the geographical or geography risks then into the system as well. So it's broken down into those 4 different pillars or 4 different headings, as Sandy alluded to in her slides. If I did need to send it up to the board on that annual basis to get the board to review this, to review and approve the BWRA, simple as clicking export. You can export it out to PDF, or Excel is probably best for this one. Excel will give us the typical kind of risk register look, or you can send it straight out to PDF and get it off to the board that way as well. So all the information can easily be pulled out of the system just like that too. And while having the business-wide risk assessment, that granular detail is great. You can see in that dummy report I had there, it was 19 pages long, so it is quite a hefty report for someone to try and read. If I come up here into dashboards, for example, I might be able to get something a bit more interactive for my board as well, or even for the management team if we are to look at this on more of an ongoing basis. So I can see my top 10 risks right across the credit union, be it money laundering or terrorist financing. If I wanted to, I could actually go and drill down into that one. I can see everything I need to know about the risk. I can see the current level of risk. I can see the previous ratings of risk. We don't have any snapshots in the system. I can see audit trail, all the controls you have in place, and any tasks we're currently working on. So from the dashboard, I can drill down and get an excerpt from those more detailed reports in the system. You can make those reports bigger as well if your eyesight is as bad as mine. And then it works on tablet, mobile, and laptop and everything else then as well. Like that as well. In the heat maps, I can come over here. I can make that a bit bigger. You can see I have a dummy risk appetite line drawn in here, and I have quite a few risks that are unfortunately outside appetite. So I want to, I could go in and drill in. I could say, what are those 5 risks there? I want to see them. They're all to do with terrorist financing. They're the 5 risk assessments, the scoring, and Stephen owns all 5 of them. So again, that can all just be point and click and drill down right into the system. Back to that point around the gaps, and what are you doing to plug the gaps to show that it's not just a once-a-year exercise or whatever it might be. I can go in, click on hi. I can see this task is due for the 3rd of July. It's to do with training, and we're going to provide AML training to staff on AML risk or to do with business accounts. Again, it's all just point and click, and it might be a bit more interactive than your typical kind of the business-wide risk assessment then as well. Lastly, then you can see I have a full green pie chart on all the compliance monitoring or control assurance or whatever it is that we're actually doing. And then over here on the control side of things, I have this interactive control widget as well. So at any point in time, I can come in and see how good my AML and terrorist financing controls are. I can decide to drill down and see what are all those satisfactory controls. I can see to do with membership. There's my full list, my ownership, the control type, and any source and frequency and everything else then as well. So the idea there basically is that we've taken what is typically kind of a manual process, usually done on spreadsheets, can be hard to report on. We've replicated it within the system, but also getting the benefits of being able to streamline it, assign out tasks, control monitoring and things like that. And then also build a bit of a dashboard then on top of it. And that's just really to bring that bit of interactivity and hopefully that bit of, I won't say buy-in because as Sandy alluded to, you have to do this. This isn't optional, but hopefully the reporting side of things make life a bit easier and that you're not spending a week every month or a week every quarter worrying about reporting on money laundering and countering financing of terrorism risks. But I think that's really it for me. So Sandy, anything I skipped over too quick, or when we have a look at the Q&A box?
No, I think that's all good. Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah. So there's a couple of questions in here, Sandy. I might give the first one to you actually, if that's okay.
Um,
So basically, yeah, I suppose the gist of the question is the business-wide risk assessment needs to be approved by the board on an annual basis, but how often should it be conducted or refreshed?
Basically, it is, that is the requirement, that it goes to the board annually. I think we all realize, though, that the ever-present nature of AML and terrorist financing risk is such that it should be considered whenever there's a material change in how the credit union is delivering its services. So whether that be a change to member onboarding processes and procedures, whether that be a new product or service that has maybe most of them have an AML risk of one shape or another, that you're doing that live as a new product or service, or as a change to procedure takes place, you're updating your AML business-wide risk assessment on a continuous basis. I guess one of the challenges I would have always seen over the years is that we tend to focus very much on the due diligence side. Have we enough renewals of passports taking place, or is the photo ID and proof of address up to date for X percentage of the membership? And that's challenging to control at the best of times. This is another way of actually showing engagement and monitoring of the AML risks on an ongoing and continuous basis. You may only have to report to the board annually, but if there is a material change, then you can communicate that through the routine AML reports to the board. So it's part of the functioning of how that risk is being managed on a continuous basis, and more importantly, how we can demonstrate it. So that's kind of would be my suggestion around that area.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I think you alluded to it as well, Sandy, in that credit unions with new service offerings and things like that as well, like that it's in
Yeah,
the past few years, the levels of new kind of, or the amount of activity around new service, be it current accounts or whatever it might be, or kind of
yeah,
green loans, agricultural loans, things like that as well. Like, will they all impact the BWRA as well? There's been a lot of activity around new products and services in the last few years.
absolutely. Huge. And also channels of delivery in terms of the move online, doing member onboarding, remote member onboarding, all of those things, whether they do all of it or parts of it, through the different channels, they all have implications for the risks around AML and CFT.
Excellent. And then there's a couple of other questions that are probably they're specific to CalcRisk as the software. So someone has asked about can you link items such as task risk controls that are in the overall credit union context or risk register to the BWRA context? Essentially, yes, in certain instances. So the idea is that you could have an AML risk in your normal credit union risk register, and then you can actually link it then to really granular risks in your BWRA then, if that makes sense. So your board are only looking at the top line AML risk, but in behind that you have all your BWRA risks linked to it as well. BWRA is a bit of a mouthful, so I'm not sure how many times I've said that on this recording, but yeah, the idea is you can have a risk in your credit union risk register that might be 10 or 11, let's say, in residual risk, but you could have 20 really granular risks backing up that scoring, if that makes sense. And then there's another question then around great to see the support for AML compliance officers and reporting and tracking. Is it something we can start to plug into CalcRisk right now, or is it something we need to request? Basically, it's available now. Yeah, we do a small bit of work on the back end of your system for anyone that's actually using CalcRisk. I suggest just dropping an email to the help desk, and we'll be in touch then with kind of next steps and stuff like that then as well. And I think that looks like it's it in terms of the questions. Does anyone have any other questions or anything? Or oh, sorry, I see actually questions here around, sorry, about the Q&A box didn't refresh there. Is there an additional cost to having this as an additional context? Yes, yeah, there's an additional cost. We'll chat to CalcRisk users kind of separately about that. But yeah, there's an additional cost to getting this all set up. Part of it is also we'll be maintaining the risks and controls as well as part of regulatory change and stuff like that too. So we'll, if anyone is interested, please do email the help desk and we'll come back to you with more details on that. There's one actually question: how do we demonstrate version control on the BWRA? So that's basically done through what we call the snapshot module here in CalcRisk. So hopefully I'm still sharing my screen. And the idea behind the snapshot module is that when you've done the BWRA, or let's say the board have actually approved it, the idea is you can take a snapshot and the system will actually store a copy of the business-wide risk assessment or the risk register at that point in time. It will date stamp it and name stamp it. At any point in time, then you can basically roll back then to that. One of the great things about using the snapshot feature in the system is you can actually demonstrate continuous improvement. So if I come in here, for example, and look at this risk, you'll notice down here the 27th of June was the first time I did the assessment. But if I actually had previous snapshots, so let's say I had this from the 27th of June 2023, and the risk was 13, for example, it'll actually store it on that report for me as well. So you can actually demonstrate continuous improvement over time as well. There's a question here about availability and training and guidance on the use of the BWRA. Absolutely, yeah. Anyone that would like it as an additional feature, we'll get it all set up. We'll show you then how to link the controls to the risks and then how to get all the reports and everything else out of it. And then depending on how far you want to go, do you want to do kind of control monitoring or compliance monitoring in the system as well? All of that is all available then as usual, as anyone that's using Calculus will know, you have lots of support and things like that there as well. There's another question here. Well, tasks that are set up in the BWRA context also show up in the main context for reporting purposes. That's possible as well, yeah. So the idea is you can basically get aggregated reports. There's just a bit of, we probably just need to figure out which way you want to do it, and that you want to take in all the risks, all the tasks, all the controls, or is it just tasks and things like that as well? So the idea is you can aggregate all the reports into one, or you can have it as very standalone and separate, really down to each individual credit union and how best it would work for your own setups and your own users. Any other questions or? Excellent. I think we'll leave it there, so if that's okay with everyone. But thanks a million for your time. And I said we'll send out the recording and the slides later on. And if anyone does have any questions, I think you all have probably myself and Sandy's email address anyway, but we'll make sure we include it in the slides going out. Do feel free to email us directly, or anyone that has any specific questions about CalcRisk, do feel free to just pop it over to the help desk as well, and we'll pick it up from there. Thanks a million, everyone.
Thanks for your time, everyone. Good to see you all. Take care.